All right, just some thoughts on altcoin dominance here. Looking at a monthly chart, then I want to go to the 3 month chart as well and look at that one. So starting off on the monthly, we're putting in lower lows, which, this cycle is not too shocking, right? Bitcoin's been kind of reigning king, and this could very well be a sign of kind of changing of the guard, so to speak, on as far as crypto goes for all future cycles. Because if this holds true, then you can imagine a world where next cycle starts out and altcoins are already like maybe way down here. And, I'm usually not a fan of trend lines, but I don't think on a monthly and, quarterly perspective, it can be less ignored than like a daily or 4 hour trend line or something like that, right? Monthly diagonal lines, I'm more of a fan of. And obviously, if you have 20 touch points, I'm more of a fan of than 2 or 3. So yeah, we only have 2 closes and a wick, but hey, let's pretend a world where we do have some kind of an alt rally sometime this year, and we are up around 10-11% again. And looking at the dates here, look at the bottom here, right? Maybe we're in Q4 and we're flirting with 10-11%. Let's not be ridiculous here. That could very well be the top for altcoins. Now, I still think there's a case to be made that alts would do, very well between there and there, assuming we do this, right? Over the next, 6-8 months. But if we get up into this area, 10-11%, maybe that's all we get. Now, could we wick higher? Yeah, maybe. But there's the high wick here. Are we going to wick higher than that? I don't know, right? We're putting in lower lows. So why would we think we're going to put in higher highs? Maybe there's a case to say that we won't. So just a kind of a reality check here that if we get up in here, October, November, December, January, any time in the next 6 to 12 months, maybe it's best to at least start to think about alts kind of wrapping it up. Doesn't mean you can't put in a new high or come back up to 13% and get a, if we got a full-blown perfect alt season, I could definitely see that scenario, but just some general guidelines, I think, best to start taking probably some bigger profits if and when we start to see 11% on this kind of dominance chart. So something to think about for the next, at the end of this kind of cycle. And who's to say we wrap up in Q4, right? I don't know. We're just kind of guessing. That's what kind of been my thesis for a year and a half, but maybe it goes in. Like maybe this is the cycle that breaks the 4-year cycle and we actually like peak in a year from now, like in sometime into 2026 and fakes everyone out, right? Absolutely. Could be a ultra right translated cycle, and this has just been a lull for a long time, and we're actually going to complete a full cycle, and something super pivotal changes, and maybe this will be evidence of that, right? We can take that in stride as we get there, but just looking at where we are now, down around 7%, 7-8%, looking at the last ultra lull in the market for altcoins back in 2019 when Bitcoin went from really that's when Bitcoin went from 3K to 14K. In this span right here, Bitcoin took off in a monumental way, sucked some liquidity from alts, then they recovered, right? But look at the percentage here. Now, I don't think, honestly, I'd rather never look back here again. Maybe we could start here. I wish like that we could start a chart from there, because we're in a completely different altcoin game now. Like the altcoin dominance from here and here, we'll never see. This is comparing Michael Jordan in middle school versus with playing the Chicago Bulls, right? It's not even comparable. So I highly believe that we shouldn't even acknowledge anything comparing now to then. If anything, like let's start with this cycle in 2023, and maybe we could say, okay, well we're still lower now. Well, this makes sense, right? I mean, looking at the start of 2023, right? Alts were still doing okay, right? We were at 11% here. We actually made a high of 13, 14, right? This is when alts were doing very well. but we're down from where we started this bull market. And I think most people's valuations are down from when we started this bull market, as far as if you just held alts, right? If you just started in alts in 2023 versus now, you might still be down. This kind of backs that up. And let's look at just the 3-month chart, and noting also this trend line still holds perfect. If you can do that on a monthly and then zoom out to the 3-month and your diagonal line still holds positive or negative, I think that's much more significant, and we can kind of start to count those with a little bit more weight than, you know, I tend to disrespect on the daily and 4-hour kind of charts for diagonal lines. So for what that's worth. So looking at this, you know, maybe our wick, right, the 3-month candles, right, all of a sudden Q4 is right here. So maybe we see a move and rally up, and noting, look at the 21 here, the EMA 8, maybe we have a really just a quarter or 2 quarters up here. And, you know, the wick comes up and maybe breaches this 12%. Maybe we get a 12% again. We'll still have a really good alt season if we have that, especially being down here, right? Imagine, you know, 46% dominance rally in altcoins over the next, you know, 6 to 12 months. You're going to see some serious moves. But again, the context of the macro outlook, and if we're up here, how exciting things will be for alts, many up 5, 10x or more. But looking at in perspective from a chart that, like, nobody, who the hell looks at a 3-month altcoin dominance chart? I've never seen one, but here you go, right? This is, you got to look at some things that other people aren't watching, and, you know, realize where we're at as far as this cycle. Maybe in 2028 we're still down here, and maybe altcoins never recover. Maybe we put in all-time lows in 2030 for altcoin dominance. Maybe Bitcoin becomes the only coin, right? I think maybe the trash gets taken out here. Like, who the hell after this cycle? Imagine if we only still do get this, and we just barely get an alt season this cycle. And then, like, we see in, you know, a couple of years from now, or start of the next cycle, and altcoins are starting way the hell down here. I'm not so sure that we'd want to do any kind of altcoins. I think, like, the altcoin seasons from past are obviously gone. And this cycle has been maybe an eye-opener to a lot of people, me included, that maybe alts aren't maybe the best path anymore. And, you know, maybe Bitcoin needs to be like a solid, like 50% at all times in our portfolio. Bitcoin's always been the end goal, to, you know, stack as much Bitcoin as possible, but altcoins, maybe a select few, right? You know, there'll always be some that greatly outperform Bitcoin, but just being able to throw darts anymore, or following some kind of narrative based on the fundamentals, I think that will probably be out the window. And picking a few is going to be harder and harder to do as time progresses. And I think this chart is like the early warning signs of showing just that. Like, this trend line may just continue forever. I wouldn't doubt it. Like, why couldn't we go back down to these numbers, right? With altcoin dominance, especially if Bitcoin's going to go to $1 million in the 10 years, which, you know, still feasible. You think altcoins are going to have a whole lot of dominance in that point? We might very well come back down here in, you know, 5, 10 years from now.